And I want to take this opportunity from the perspective of my own research and activism to focus on the challenge that the very idea of equality poses to Muslim legal tradition. And also the promise and the potential of the new voices, new reformist and feminist voices and scholarship in Islam in meeting that challenge. My aim is twofold here, so I basically want to do two things in this lecture, and I hope you can bear with me because it is 60 minutes I have, which is a luxury. And first is to argue that the struggle for gender equality and justice in Muslim context is part of a larger struggle. We cannot just look at it as rights for women, equality for women, but it is part of a much larger struggle for social justice and democracy as well. And in this struggle is embedded both in theological and political issues. And at times it is really difficult to decide where the theology ends and where the politics begins, or vice versa. And the second point, and what I want to say, that it is important to recognize that this struggle is as much theological as it is political. So we need to bring both of them together. And the second aim that I have is to give an idea of the work of feminist scholars and activists who argue for justice and equality, gender equality from within an Islamic tradition, and how they seek to change the terms of traditional Islamic discourses on gender, and how they have opened a new conversation with both feminism as a knowledge project, because I don't see feminism only as a consciousness or an activism. Feminism is a knowledge project as well, part of the critical branches of studies, which gives us the tools, the methodologies to look at how gender can distort realities, can distort our perceptions of reality. So the second thing is how they open this conversation, both with feminism and also with human rights. And I do this with a particular reference to Musawa, and also to a project that I convened for Musawa. I will talk about Musawa later, but just for the time being, I want to say that most of you might know Arabic, and you know that Musawa means equality. And it is a movement that brings scholarship and justice, scholarship and activism together to argue for equality and justice from within Muslim legal tradition, and also to bring a fresh perspective on Islamic teachings and contribute constructively to the reform of Muslim family laws. And what I will do here, I was one of the founding members of Musawa. So I describe how this movement came about, which is part of a larger changes that started to happen at the end of 20th century, and talk about formations of it, and also try to convey some of our thinking behind it. But first, I want to say a few words about my position and also my approach, basically where I am coming from. Because I'm one of those scholars who doesn't believe in the objectivity of knowledge. We all have a position and we come to issues from a position. My approach and analysis are those of a trained anthropologist, a legal anthropologist. But I do not claim to be a detached observer. As a Muslim woman, I'm a committed participant in the debates over and the struggle for gender equality in Islamic law. Since the early 1980s, my research has been focused on laws that regulate marriage and divorce in Muslim legal tradition, and basically laws that regulate sexuality, because marriage and divorce, marriage as an institution, that is a lot to do with regulation of sexuality in society. And then I examine these laws from a critical feminist perspective and attempt a kind of ethnography of the juristic constructs on which the whole edifice of gender inequality in Islamic legal tradition is built. In the 1980s, I did field work in family laws in Iran and Morocco. And at that time, my main question was, what does it mean to be married and divorced under Islamic law? Therefore, as an anthropologist, I didn't focus at the state legislation or Islamic tradition, but on the court cases, on the marital dispute cases, how men and women argue for their cases, what are the strategies that they use. And in 1990s, my research interest and focus changed. And I began studying fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, and I did field work in Qom, the Center of Religious Debate, which led to my second book. And at that time, my interest really moved to the construction of genders, because construction of family law, how this idea of family law is constructed within Muslim legal tradition. And since early 2000, I crossed the line between scholarship and activism after becoming involved with women's group, basically because I started studying Islamic feminism. And at the end, I became an Islamic feminist as well by studying it. So I started research and work with an organization called Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. And it is then that my research has become focused on contributing to the development and egalitarian family law from within Muslim legal tradition. And I put the emphasis on the family law because family law is the mother law. And it is so important, and if we want change in society and gender perspectives, this is actually the place that we need to start. Now, I want to give you the gist of my argument and then try to flesh it out as far as possible. There are two related elements to my argument here. First, gender equality is a modern ideal, which only recently, with the expansion of human rights and feminist discourses, became inherent to generally accepted conceptions of justice. That means that we could have justice without equality, definitely without gender equality. So that is absolutely a modern idea. And it was not part of the legal landscape of Muslim legal tradition like other religions. It was not a matter that a Muslim jurist had to deal with. Why? Because it was not part of the reality of the time. Therefore, if we want to use an Islamic expression, we say that they are among the newly created issues. I.e., these are the questions that are now raised and the tradition needs to find an answer for it. This is the first line of argument that is new. The second line of my argument is that the idea of gender equality has created what we can call it an epistemological crisis within Muslim legal tradition that Muslims have been trying to meet since early 20th century. But my argument is that the breakthrough came in the second part of the 20th century with the rise of feminist voices and scholarship. This epistemological crisis, I took this from philosopher Alistair McIntyre. And basically, I put it here for you, which is a quote from him, that every rational inquiry, like Islamic jurisprudence or sociology or whatever, is embedded in a tradition of learning. It has its own literature, it has its own point of reference and arguments. That tradition reaches a point of crisis when the arguments from within cannot be dealt rationally. And I think that is the case with idea of equality. At the same time, we see that all Muslims say that Islam is just women are equal to men, but then we have laws like that. So there is something that is not working. And so according to McIntyre, what happens is that when the tradition reaches that, the alien idea gradually is adopted by the tradition and it's made of its own. And as I said, my argument is that equality faces Muslim legal tradition with that challenge. And the turning point came with the rise of feminist voices and scholarship in Islam. And I now want to turn to map the development of the background against which this Islamic new voices came into existence. And in that background, as I said, it is in the 20th century, and I see two major turning points. The first one is the rise of political Islam in the 1970s. And the second turning point is the Al-Qaeda attacks at 9/11/2001 in New York. So these, in America, other places, and probably the aftermath of that attack. And I want to start with the resurgence of political Islam. And to me, the main point of departure of this was the Iranian Revolution, 1979. And I think this was also a turning point. The revolution unfolded between 1978 and 79. And this was a turning point in the history of Islam and Muslim women's place in the Western imaginary. Until then, the standard expectation among the general public, among intellectuals from left and right, among feminists and in academia was that religion, including Islam, would gradually retreat and that modernization would do away with religious manifestations and symbols in public space. You're all familiar with this modernization thesis, which proved not to be absolutely accurate. Hijab, the most potent and loaded of Islamic symbols, was almost absent from public space. Until the late 1970s, it was indeed rare to see a woman wearing hijab, whether in Europe or in most modern public spaces in the Muslim world, such as in universities, in offices, in restaurants, and places like this. All that changed with the resurgence of Islam as a political and spiritual force. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was the acme of this resurgence, a vivid testimony to the power and force of Islam as a political ideology for mass mobilization. It gave hope and confidence to the Muslim masses, a sense of pride that they badly needed. They needed to know that they could change a corrupt and unjust regime even though it was supported by the Western powers, the ex-colonial forces. This was no small realization. But at the same time, Iranian Revolution was a revolution that unfolded in front of camera. And one of the enduring, but at the same time puzzling aspects, images, was a large number of women with chador, black chador. Chador is the Iranian hijab or covering, leading the demonstrations. So that was problematic for many. Meanwhile, in the intellectual field, the dominant Western narrative and representation of Islam was unraveling. Why isn't it moving? Oh, yes. Edward Edward Said's Orientalism, you must be all familiar with the Orientalism. It came out in 1978, at the time of when Iranian Revolution was unfolding, and had an impact on Western academia almost as significant as that of Iranian Revolution. Said condemned the academic field of Oriental studies for lacking the objectivity that it claimed, and argued that representation of the East has served to justify Europe's colonial rule. One of the Said's arguments that is relevant to our discussion can be summarized as follows. The construction of identity in every age and every society involves establishing opposites and others. We need an other to define ourselves. Oriental studies led to the West to see Islamic culture as static in both time and place, and uniform, and as incapable of defining itself. This gave Europe a sense of its cultural and intellectual superiority, seeing itself as dynamic, innovative, expanding, an expanding culture, as well as being, I quote from him, the spectator, the judge, the jury of every facet of the Orient's behavior, end of quote. Edward Said's book was part of the emerging post-colonial and post-modern turn that brought a level of complexity to both public and academic discourses on Islam and the Muslim world that was not there before. Scholars were now trained to recognize and examine the power of representation, the power of naming, and the power of defining the others, and taking that power from a group to define themselves. And also, above all, which related to Foucault, is the intimate links between knowledge and power, production of knowledge and exercise of power. This was the context in which the meaning and symbolism of hijab came to fore and was contested. One of the cultural manifestations of the political Islam was that women voluntarily took hijab. At first in small scale, in few countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and later in Sudan, laws were passed that made wearing hijab in public mandatory. But that was not the case in other majority Muslim countries. But in these majority Muslim countries, women were taking hijab. And also, Muslim women in the West started wearing hijab. And you are young, you cannot remember this, but this was new in 1980s and 1970s. And this choice, the choice of opting for hijab, was offensive and incomprehensible to some feminists, for whom wailing had been the potent symbol of women's subjugation in Islam. Why should women opt for such a manifest tool of their oppression? They construed such Muslim women's choices as a rejection of a Western and modern way of life and values, which was certainly the case for some. But for a large majority, it was reclaiming their own identity, and also reclaiming the way that they wanted to be, to dress. So the element of choice was very strong there. All of a sudden, there was an angry debate. Hijab represented so many opposed ideas about the state, the role of women, control over the body, sexual mores, and codes of morality and value. In that polarized debate, to be a feminist meant to oppose hijab. And all it stood for, including Islam. To choose hijab meant one was duped, one was fooled by religion, by political Islam, and therefore what could not be possibly a feminist. What was lost in this debate was that the political Islam, like other ideologies, carried its own seeds of change. One of its neglected and paradoxical results was that it helped to create space, an arena within which Muslim women could reconcile their faith and identity with a feminist struggle for their gender equality. It is important to remember, to recall how and why Muslim women early on faced a difficult choice when feminism as a consciousness, a movement, a knowledge project was entangled with the politics of colonialism. In the early part of the 20th century, in the course of the Muslim struggle for independence from colonial powers, women became both carriers of tradition and symbols of cultural and religious identity. On the one hand, colonial discourses construed Islam as irreconcilable with the central features of modernity, including women's emancipation. On the other hand, anti-colonialist and nationalist movements saw feminism, the advocacy for women's rights, as part of the colonial project that they rejected. Those women who acquired a feminist consciousness at the time were under pressure to conform to anti-colonial priorities. Any dissent could be construed as a kind of betrayal. They were faced with what Leila Ahmed calls a choice between betrayal and betrayal. On the one hand, by rejecting feminism, they were betraying their own new consciousness, the own way that they related to themselves as women. And by accepting feminism, they were also rejecting their own culture, their own struggle for independence. And the legacy of Orientalism was that. I think, yes, I put the quote, it's not from the book, but it is from an earlier article that Leila Ahmed wrote. And for much of the 20th century, in many Muslim countries, the growing numbers of educated and middle-class women chose the path of emancipation and put their faith in the private space where it's supposed to belong. But political Islam asked for the faith to be in the public space. But as the 20th century came to a close, this was no longer the case. 1979 was not only the year of the Iranian Revolution, Iranian Revolution, it was also the year when gender equality acquired a new international legal mandate. The UN Assembly adopted the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as SIDA, which actually it is important because it put women's rights at the very forefront as a mandate of human rights. And that happened in 1979. And SIDA, adopted in 1979, was adopted and came into force 2 years later, 82. The 1980s saw the concomitant development, globally and locally, of two powerful but seemingly opposed trends and developments. On the one hand, with the encouragement of SIDA, the international women's movement expanded, and NGOs emerged. It is important to know that in Muslim context, there was no such a thing as NGO, not governmental organization, funded by outsiders. There were women's movement and organizations, but not in that form. So NGOs are a new phenomenon. With international funding and transnational links to give women a voice in policy making and public debate over the law. On the other hand, Islamist political movements, whether in power or in opposition, started to invoke Sharia in order to dismantle earlier efforts at reforming and secularizing laws and legal system. Tapping into into public demands for social justice, they presented this dismantling as Islamization and as a first step in bringing about their vision of a moral and just society. By the early 1990s, the conflict between these two isms, feminism and Islamism, gave rise to a new discourse that came to be called Islamic feminism. I was one of the first who used the term Islamic feminism. And it's basically, I went back to Iran in 1992, and by then, 10 years, a decade after the revolution, there was a new discourse. The very women who supported the revolution and even played a role in suppressing and silencing the secular women voices no longer saw Islam, that version of Islam, as an ally. But they saw feminism as an ally that could give them something. So their demands were feminist in the sense that they were arguing for equality and justice in all fronts. But at the same time, the source of this feminism was Islamic. So they located their legitimacy of their arguments in Islam. And it was then that I basically adopted the term Islamic feminism for that. And I argued, I have written quite a lot about Islamic feminism that I don't want to repeat here, but basically, I argued in my writing that Islamic feminism is the unwanted child of political Islam. Why? Because political Islam came into power at the end of the 20th century when women were educated, but at the same time wanted to take them back to the pre-modern laws. And it opened the space. It opened the space for women to contest that. So women went back to Islam's sacred texts and found a different understanding of it. But it's not illegitimate child of Islam. It is unwanted child of political Islam. In my view, it is very much legitimate. Now let me go to the second turning point. And the second turning point, which really changed the Western perceptions, as well as Muslim perception of themselves and the West, was the politics and rhetorics that started aftermath of 9/11, war on terror. The illegal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, both partially justified at promoting democracy, freedom, and women's rights, combined with the double standards employed in promoting UN sanctions, the subsequent revelations and abuses by Americans in Abu Ghraib and in Afghanistan background have all, in the eyes of many, discredited both the international human rights and feminist ideals. Because these feminist ideals, as international human rights, could not stop these atrocities. At the same time, for many Muslims, the appeal of Islamism has been dented by the human rights abuses committed by Islamists in power. Notably, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the hardliners in Islamic Republic of Iran, and the rulers of some Muslim states. And of course, most recently, Daesh, the so-called Islamic State. Yet, rightly or wrongly, many Muslims perceive the war on terror to be directed against them, which not only made them insecure and more likely to cling to their religious tradition, but also this is, and this is really my point, what I want to make, is that it took away the legitimacy, the high moral ground of human rights and feminism away. At the same time, it dented the political Islam, because both of these isms were unable to deliver justice. And it is the time that space is open for some meaningful argument. And okay, I went I will go away, but later on I show you a diagram that summarizes all the points that I raised. It was then that many of us, as Muslims and feminism, found ourselves in the crossfire. On the one hand, Islamists were denying us equality in the name of Sharia. On the other, hegemonic global powers were pursuing a neo-colonial agenda in the name of feminism and human rights. The way out of this predicament for some of us was to bring Islamic and feminist frameworks together. The vast majority of women whose rights we championed were believers and wanted to live according to the teachings of Islam. Thus, effective change, we believed, could come not through rejection and confrontation, but only through a meaningful and constructive engagement with those teachings. To do this, we needed to reclaim the egalitarian ethos of Islam's sacred text and to create a public voice for our vision of Islam. We faced two different forms of resistance. One came from the religious establishment, leaders and groups who claimed to know and speak in the name of authentic Islam and Sharia. They view both international human rights and feminism with suspicion and refuse to engage meaningfully with their advocates. But it is their vision of Islam, not ours, not the egalitarian Islam, that reaches most women, who consequently do not necessarily share our quest for legal equality. The other form of resistance came from those feminist scholars and activists, and mainly the NGOs, Muslim women's NGOs in Muslim context, who were reluctant to engage with religious perspectives and on women's issue. For many of them, Islam itself was the main problem, was the main obstacle in their struggle for equality, and they were only comfortable working within human rights framework. One of the very few NGOs, women's NGOs, that was happy to identify as both Islamic and feminist is the Malaysian-based Sisters in Islam. And it came into existence in 1988. And in fact, we can say it is among the first groups of the Islamic feminism that came. And I started working with them in 2000. Working with them, I mean as a scholar, producing papers for them. And in February 2007, Zaina Anwar, the founder and director of Sisters in Islam, organized a workshop in Istanbul that brought a diverse groups of women activists and scholars from different countries together. The meeting led to the formation of a planning committee, charged with the task of setting out the vision, principles, and conceptual framework of the movement that we called Musawa, with the aim of forging a new strategy. And in fact, when we started, we thought, we have this fantastic knowledge, we produce papers, and then we come with a big bang and everybody will be convinced. But soon we realized that we are talking about a movement. It is not going to happen like this. So between 2007 and 2009 that Musawa was launched, we came up with a framework for action. And in this, and also several publications that you can find on our websites. Drawing on the new wave of reformist thought and feminist scholarship in Islam, we devised and published a framework for action in which we grounded our claim for equality and arguments for reform simultaneously in Islamic and human rights framework, i.e. bringing these two frameworks together. Taking a critical feminist perspective, but most importantly, working within the tradition of Islamic legal thought, we invoked two crucial distinctions in that tradition. And these two distinctions okay, that one should come later, I must remember, is the difference between Sharia and fiqh. Sharia in Arabic means path, and in the Quran appears, but never in the sense of referring to law. And in fact, the term Sharia did not acquire its meaning as a law until in the first 2 centuries of Islam. It was later that became synonymous to law. And it basically means the path to the source of water. But understanding of Sharia is done by Muslim jurists, by the science that is known as fiqh. Fiqh literally means understanding. And it is the effort of the jurists working through the methodology of usul al-fiqh, that is the methodology of Islamic legal tradition, legal theory, to find rulings from Quran and Hadith, the 2 sacred texts, by using the methods. The methods, one of them you all know, it is consensus, ijma, among the jurists. And the second is qiyas, which is a form of analogical reasoning. It is reasoning, so at the basis of that it is reasoning, but it is a restricted reasoning. So what we really get of Sharia is always an understanding. It's always a fiqh. And this understanding is human, it is temporal, and also definitely contextual one. And there is nothing sacred about fiqh. It is a science like any. But what is sacred and transcendental is Sharia, which gives us, it's a transcendental in Muslim idea. It is the way that was revealed to the Prophet through via Quran of life. And this is the basis of the teaching. So this distinction is important, because once you make that distinction, you remain within the tradition, but you can challenge patriarchal and undemocratic ones, because they were time bound. I'm not saying that that jurists were unkind or unjust. They were men of their own time. And what is so important for us to remember, that by the time that the fiqh schools emerged, which was more than 150 years after the death of the Prophet, women's voices were silenced. Women no longer were part of the production of knowledge. We know the Hadith tradition, which is the second source of Islamic law. Women are among the main transmitters of Hadith. Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, was really an authority on that. But by the time that fiqh comes, their voices is not there. And this is actually what I call the working of patriarchy, that silences women's voices. I don't mean that they were not there, they were scholars, but their voices were not recorded. Because what we always get of history is a narrative, not exactly the facts are happening. And it is interesting to know that Shafi, as you know, is the founder, known as the founder of Islamic jurisprudence. One of his teachers was Sayyida Saida, a woman. But there is no name of her. And one of the things that Islamic feminism as a knowledge-building movement does is to recover these voices, to mine the tradition in order to recover these voices. Okay, and the second distinction that we make, again we take it from Muslim legal tradition, from the fiqh, is the division between 2 categories of rulings. One is called ibadat, which deals with the ritual acts, devotional acts, and that regulates the relationship of the believer with God. And there is no way that it can be enforced by the state. It is a personal and direct relationship with God. And the second is ma'amilat, which literally means contract and social interactions. So what we have as law, in family law, criminal law, or whatever falls under ma'amilat. And in ma'amilat, the jurists accept there are rational basis for it. Qiyas is a rational base, and ijma, consensus, is a rational base. So through a rational process they are understood. And so So what we are dealing with is actually in the area of mu'amala that are open to interpretation and open to rationalization. And as I said, these distinctions give us a new language, and language is important. And our main objective is to insert women's voices in the process of production of knowledge. And I already covered some of the issues that I wanted to say here, and I think it is important to do that. Why? Because women's voices were silenced, so their concerns were not reflected in the law and in knowledge. And secondly, because there is a divide between the religious people, scholars, that with all due respect, large majority of Muslim scholars and ulama are gender blind. For them, gender as a category of analysis does not exist. And this is really one of the important contributions of feminism. And then we have the women's rights activists, feminists who really do not want to engage with religion. So it is important to bridge this gap. And this is basically what Musawa does. I have a video which is 6 minutes, but I don't want to show it now. I will show it later. And which can give you an idea of, the spirit of Musawa and what we do. But now I want to go to the first research project that we conducted, that we started in 2010. And this research project, okay, I won't show the video. And I have another there. So this research project that we conducted, where did I go? Oh, sorry. Okay. There are two concepts in Islamic jurisprudence in fiqh that really serve, I call it the DNA of patriarchy in Muslim legal tradition. They are called qawama and velaya. And I use the Arabic names for it, but qawama is a man's right, authority over his wife. And it is a right that a man acquires after marriage. I don't want to talk about marriage and marriage contract, but with a marriage contract, a woman comes under the qawama of the husband, which is protection, but with protection you always get domination, okay? And a set of rights and duties. And velaya is the right that a male member of the family has over an unmarried woman. You might have heard it that for a woman to enter marriage needs a wali, needs a guardian. So these two concepts are in so many ways like a linchpin of patriarchy in Muslim legal tradition. And for us it was important to understand why. And that was a decision that we made based on a previous research project that I was involved in, which is part of the new direction in Islamic legal thought. And the second phase of this research project, I was the lead researcher, and we really, instead of looking at divorce, child marriage, and issues like this, we decided to look at the concepts that institutionalizes, legitimizes, and sustains male dominance. And that was how we got it to qawama and velaya. And this book is a scholarly book, in a sense that, there are scholars and anthropologists, without taking a position. But what we wanted to do in our project in Musawa, we really wanted to take a position, in the sense that the project has three elements. One element and objective of the project is to produce feminist knowledge that engages with these two concepts and opens the way for rethinking them and redefining them in accordance with the lived reality of Muslims and also the contemporary conception of justice in which equality is inherent. And the second element of the project was what we call empirical side of it. That is that to do research, and this research was largely done by our advocates, to understand where is the place of these two concepts in the life of individuals, how it governs and shapes the life of a woman from the moment she is born until gets married, if divorced, or whatever. So that was a life series. And then the third element is to open spaces, to bring this, and at the same time doing this research, scholars who do the theoretical papers present their work to the activists. And activists, they take this work to the grassroots. And here I just want to talk briefly about the first element of the project, and after that I will show the film and end. You know, when you look at the Qawama and Velaya, it takes you to verse 434. And many of you, if you're Muslim, you know this verse. If you are not, you must have heard it because it is always invoked as a way saying that Islam denies, the Quran denies women the right of equality. And this verse is important because it's a key verse. And the words that I highlighted are now the center of contestation. There is now a huge number of debate and research in every language that you can imagine on understanding in terms. And what I put here in the brackets is not the translation. It is the consensus of the jurists, how jurists understood it. And I've taken this translation from Keisha Ali. And she has a as part of the research that she did, she studied different translations of these verses. And her argument rightly is that every translation is an interpretation. How you translate is an interpretation. So I'm just putting the interpretation of this classical jurist. And if we look at the marriage contract, after marriage, a man acquires authority over women. Why? Because he's considered to be qawamun. And then women are obedient because they are qanitat. But qanitat means totally different thing in the Quran. And then if they are not obedient, they are in state of nushuz and lose their rights, and then the husband has the right to discipline them. So that is the essence of it. And what we did was basically try to understand how this concept of qawama emerged. And in fact, qawama is important because, you know, when we look at all this that privileges men, from polygamy, women's lesser share of inheritance, men's right to unilateral divorce, all of them are really based on the fact that men have authority over women. Men are qawama over women. So for that reason, it is really important to tackle it. But what we found through this study was that, first of all, the term qawamun exists in the Quran, or qawamin, but not qawama, which is a verbal noun. And the term qawamun or qawamin appears 3 times in the Quran. One in the verse 434, that the jurists understood it as men are maintainers of women have authority. In 2 other places, it appears in the sense of standing for justice. So it has to do with justice. And I have put all the verses that it is here. And Velaya, the term appears in the Quran. And I have put all the verses here, but never in the sense of authority of a father or a man over children. It has a totally different meaning. It means support, alliance and friendship. And in relation to marriage and divorce, so we see Qawamun appears only once, and the entire edifice of family law is based on that. But in relation to marriage and marital relations, there are other terms that appear many times in the Quran. Ma'ruf, according to what is right, according to what is accepted as the right thing by the society. So ma'ruf of each time can change. Ihsan, mawadda and rahma, love and compassion. And so the question that we ask in the research is that how and why those other terms were not the basis of lawmaking, and qawama became the basis of the lawmaking. And basically, why qawama is such a strong concept, why it is enduring, and what is its role. So these are, I won't talk about it, these are the different chapters of our book that talk about qawama. Okay, two questions to ask. So the first product of the book is this, men in charge, with a big question mark, okay? And when we translated in Arabic, you know, we had to change it, because to have men in charge, we had to put men qawamun, which would have been really problematic, because it could have appeared as question in the Quran. So we said qawama in Muslim legal tradition. So rethinking male authority. There are different chapters in this book, and these chapters actually show how this qawama was developed, through what process, and how it can be rethink in a different way. Now, I want to end, and before the ending, I want to show you that okay. This is basically the forces and context. Two turning points, 1979 and 2001. I put a third turning point with a big question mark, because usually we know about a turning point long after that it is passed, and that is launch of Musawa and also the emergence of green movement in Iran, which has happened exactly 30 years after the rise of the establishment of Islamic Republic, and Arab uprisings, and the rise of Islamic anti-revolutionary, that is Arab revolution and counter-revolutionary, and all this. So we are actually happening. There is a process of change that is happening. Now, let me conclude, and after that, if you still can bear, I can show you two small videos. Musawa is only one among several movements around the Muslim world that are now active in meetings as well as through lively online and social media debates, challenging from within the authoritarian and patriarchal ethics of established interpretations of the Sharia and paving the ground for the egalitarian gender discourse from within. But, it's the big but that I have. Do they stand a chance? Can a feminist discourse that takes its legitimacy from Islam's sacred texts and has to operate within a closed legal system like FER, with little support, and in fact with a lot of opposition from the power base in that tradition, i.e. the Muslim jurists, bring transformations from within? My answer to this question is a qualified yes for three reasons. The first is legal traditions and theories must be understood in the cultural, political, and social context in which they exist and operate. Gender equality is a modern ideal which only recently, with the expansion of the human rights and feminist discourses, has become inherent to generally accepted conceptions of justice. In Islam, as in other traditions, religious tradition and other legal tradition, the idea of equality, gender equality, did not exist. But now it exists. So something must be done with that. By the end of the 20th century, Muslim legal theory started to engage with this. And my idea, my thesis is that legal theory is always behind the practice. The practice changes, and then the law catches up with it, with a lot of struggle. So no change in the law comes without pressure from below, without the changes in economy, in social mores, or whatever. And if we look at the West, we see the same. In fact, Muslim legal tradition, fiqh, gave women a better set of rights than any Western law until 19th century. In England, it was only after 1882 that married women acquired the right to property, to own their own property. Before that, it was not the case, whereas always in fiqh and in Islam, women had economic independence. Secondly, the struggle for gender equality is part of a larger struggle for social justice, democracy, and pluralism. In Muslim context, this struggle is as much political as it is theological, one of my main arguments. Though it is difficult to draw a line where theology ends and politics begins. A growing popular understanding of the nature of this struggle has been one of the many unintended consequences of the rise of political Islam and the politics of the war of terror. So it is apparent now. It has become transparent, the link between theology and politics. These developments reveal the extent to which women's rights in Muslim contexts are vulnerable to local and global power structure between forces with other priorities. Muslim feminists articulate a public voice that can break down ideological polarizations such as those between secular and religious feminism, religious feminism, Islam, and human rights, to which women's quest for equality and in turn the transition to democracy have remained hostage since the early 20th century. And this points us to the main site of the struggle. The main site of the struggle is not Islam and human rights, or feminism or religion, but the main site of the struggle is between patriarchal and authoritarian forces on one side, whether they come in a religious disguise or in a secular disguise, like what is happening with Mr. Trump, and the egalitarian and pluralist and democratic ideologies and forces on the other. And once we know where is the main site of struggle, it is only then that we can aspire to real and meaningful change that can dent the deeply embedded patriarchal assumptions and tendencies that have shaped our religious culture and political realities. Thank you.